Hello, crypto boys and ghouls, and welcome back to the channel, Tales from the Cryptmancer, where we feature content on play and earn games on the blockchain, such as Splinterlands. And in today's video, I think I have a very important, subset of data that anyone playing Splinterlands should be interested in. And walk with me through this exercise because I think you're going to find the data to be very interesting. And what we're going to do today here is we're going to try and predict what percentage of land will be worked on the launch of Land 1.5. And this is an interesting data point because, well, it has so many other related data points that are also equally interesting. And what I want to do in today's exercise is get to the kind of the bottom of where I think we might see land being worked on day one here. And, it's interesting because there's a lot in the community that's, estimating different numbers. Some are saying 10% of land will be worked. Some are saying 20%. Others are saying 40%. There's all kinds of numbers out there. And I wanted to try and do my best to get a really solid estimate for my own purposes, personal purposes, for my land planning. And I wanted to share the exercise with you because you might find it interesting as well. Now, the basis of this exercise is going to be coming from the land rich list on splintercards.com. This shows the ownership of plots of land in Splinterlands here. And you can see this here. What's interesting to note about this data, which is kind of an interesting side note here, there are, in Splinterlands right now, there are a total of 3,737 unique landowners, named landowners in Splinterlands. And this is an important number. We've talked about it in the past, because what this kind of gives us is a subset of the real human active players in the Splinterlands ecosystem, I would say, let's say within the last 6 months. Because if you own a plot of land and you've basically claimed it here, I don't know if it's actually, I think it's a combination of surveyed and claimed is here, because it's the total number is 134,753. And you'll notice here, if we go to the land data for Pretoria, right now we have 15,247 unclaimed plots of land. So 10.2% is unclaimed still. So that number there of 3,737 unique users are those that have claimed their land but may or may not have surveyed the land. Why is that number unique? Because I think it gives a pretty good picture, again, of how many human players in the active Splinterlands ecosystem is a subset of that, right? Not every player that plays Splinterlands as a human player is going to own a plot of land, but it's a good baseline to say there's at least 3,737 human asset owners or players within the Splinterlands ecosystem, certainly more than that, but that's probably the bare minimum human presence here. It's, again, a subset. And I think that's an accurate picture because I don't think people take their land necessarily and divide it all up amongst their alts or alternate accounts. Some may do it for certain purposes, but that's a very few number of people. So again, I think from an order of magnitude, that paints a really good picture. But that's not what this video is about. This video isn't about the number of players we actually have in the Splinterlands ecosystem. It's really about, again, what percentage of land is going to be worked on the 1.5 launch. So what I did is I exported that data into a quick Google Doc, and I did some calculations. I'm going to share my rough estimates for data. You can obviously do what you want with the data. You can maybe change it, manipulate, massage it, get your own estimates. But here's the data that I'm going to share with you. Again, we have 134,753 plots that are owned and claimed right now in Splinterlands out of the 150,000. And what I did is I estimated that for those players that own less than 20 plots. I figured that on day one, 100% of those players are going to be able to work their lands in some form or fashion. So what that means is if you do the math, there are 10,827 plots that are basically make up that kind of subset of players that own 20 plots or less. Now, if we go back and we look at the data and we say, well, and let me expand this column so you can see it a little bit better. I estimated that for those players that own essentially a tract and maybe some extra plots of land, so somewhere between over 20 plots of land but less than 121 plots of land, I said roughly of those tract owners primarily 50% of those lands would be worked on day one. So I figured that if you own a single tract of land, basically you can probably get online on day one 50%. Now certainly some will get more, some will get less, but I figured that's a reasonable average. So that means 23,394 total plots fall into that subset of 50% as an estimate. And then I looked at the next subset of plots and I said for those that own more than one tract of land, but less than 4 tracts of land, so somewhere between 1 to 4 tracts of land, I figure those individuals could probably get about 30% of their land worked on day one. Now 30% of roughly 4 tracts is 120 plots out of 400. I figure if you own 4 plots, that's probably reasonable based on the assets that you would probably have in the game. And you can see that detail here. Now, what also we have here is I then said of those players that own more than 4 tracts. So if you own 5 tracts or more, or own a region, I figure those individuals probably aren't going to be able to work more than 10% of their land on day one. Now, here's an interesting number. The number of plots that encompass that subset of data of people that own 5 tracts or more is 83,701 total plots of land. We're going to revisit that number at the end of this video, but just put that on the side for now. So basically, when you do the math here and we say 100% of those that own 20 plots or less are going to work all their plots, 50% for those that basically own a tract, 50% of those plots will be worked on day one, 30% for those that own 4 tracts or less, and then 10% for those that own 5 tracts or more. What that basically translates to as an estimate is 35,943 total plots of land are estimated to be worked on day one if you use this model as an estimation. And what does that mean? It means, well, 28.2% of, if I could spell again, spelling is hard it seems these days, 28.2% of the total plots of land here would be worked on day one. And that 28.2% is taking it out of the surveyed plots of land, the current surveyed plots of land. Now, if we actually just updated this for the total plots here, which would be 150,000. If you took the totality of Pretoria, it would be 23.96% of the 150,000. So depending on how you want to look at that data, either 28.2% of the currently surveyed plots of land, or basically 24% of the 150,000 total plots of land is the estimate. So there you go. That's kind of my estimate based on this quick back of the Google Doc spreadsheet here on what we can get to. It's not 10%, it's not 20%, but we're looking at probably 23.96% of total land based on this model. Now, what does that mean from a DEC perspective? Well, I guess you could try and extrapolate that. I mean, to see what kind of DEC would be locked up. If we did a quick exercise here and said that, again, these plots here, it's 35,943 plots will be active on day one. Not all of these are going to have 50,000 DEC staked. Let's just take 50% of that. Let's say 25,000 DEC staked per plot of land is the average. What does that mean? It means that we might expect or might estimate 898.575 million DEC being staked on land on day one. Is that enough to start the flywheel? Is that enough to get us to all where we want to be to start burning SPS? Well, we'll maybe have another video on that specific number and that estimate to talk about that. But we know we have right now in total circulation probably around between 4.6 and 4.7 billion DEC. So that number is not 4. It's not 100% of the DEC in circulation. So it may not certainly take up all of the DEC in circulation, but it might take up maybe 25% of what's remaining in circulation and stake it on day one. The question would then be, how much of that truly like 4.7 billion DEC is liquid? How much is available to come off LPs, off of people's wallets and get staked? That's the bigger question, and that's going to determine what happens with the DEC price and subsequently the SPS price. One last thing I'll leave you with, which I thought was a very interesting fact here, just to spin on a little bit here. 55.8% of all the land in Pretoria, 55.8% of 150,000 total plots of land are owned by 67 human players. Let me read that piece of data for you one more time. 55.8% of all land is owned by just 67 individuals in the universe. What does this mean? Well, it's an interesting piece of data because it means that land is very, very top heavy, still to this day, even with land being sold on the market. It means that a very, very small percentage, again, if we're saying that there's at least 3,737 human players in the game, and there's obviously more than that, there's probably more than 5,000, because that's just a subset, because not all landowners are all the players in the game. But basically 67 players of that, let's just say for an estimate, 5,000 players in Splinterlands own more than 55% of all land. So what's interesting about this when you think about it is, well, if you look at the card disbursement here amongst Splinterlands, now collection power, we're looking here at peak monsters. Now, collection power is not an exact calculation here for production points, but it's pretty close. I mean, there's definitely some correlation here. And you can see here that the top 67 players for collection power, stops at 9.4 million. But what you see here, the top 200 for collection power, it's much more linear here. Top 200 is 4.254 million. So what does this mean when you compare the card, allocation of cards in Splinterlands to the land allocation? Well, the good news for most players out there is that, yes, only 67 players own a majority of land, but the cards, which are required to be put on land, are allocated across much more than 67 players from a, density perspective. So there's a lot more cards kind of spread out amongst all the card ownership amongst more players. So that's good news for the average landholder, because what it means is that even if a landowner here, like if I go to the rich list, back to the rich list just for a second, what it means is that, well, if you're Vuctus, you have a lot of cards in addition to a lot of land. Let's just take another name on this list. Let's just take, for example, Matt Clark. Matt Clark, love Matt Clark, a pillar of example for this community here. He is number 8 on the rich list. He owns 2 regions plus a tract and some extra land here, it looks like. Chances are, even though Matt Clark has a horde of flesh golems and probably creeping oozes and rusty androids to be able to put on his land, chances are he's not going to be able to populate all of his land because he has a ton of land, 2,127 plots. He probably doesn't have the requisite cards to be able to put on that land. So what does that mean? Again, if a small number of players have a large amount of land but don't have the cards to put on that land, what it means for the average player in Splinterlands, for example, in Land 1.5, if you are, maybe perhaps thinking about farming SPS, means you still have a chance to possibly earn, at least reasonable rewards in SPS. We'll have to see how it all works out. I mean, obviously, players that own more cards and higher quality land are going to get more, higher percentage of the SPS pool. But because, again, the card ownership is dispersed amongst many more players, you might still have a good chance to get what is a reasonable amount of SPS on a daily basis compared to today, where it's spread out as peanut butter across all essentially 134,000 claimed plots of land or 127,000 surveyed plots of land. So interesting data there. I will leave that with you just to kind of spin on for a little bit. Think about that, what that means. I'm going to come back with another video here in the near future talking about some of the expectations around land, around production points, around SPS reward pools. I think you're going to want to see some of that data as well. It's pretty interesting, I believe. We're going to talk about cost of land, cost of production points, and what it all breaks down to between the biggest of whales down to perhaps the smallest of minnows. So until next time, keep stacking those stats.